Monday evening. Live Broadcast Studio in New York. You can perceive that there exists a specific moment when the pressure of the air changes, when millions of people tune in simultaneously, waiting for words that will shape their opinions for the next 7 days. And on that night, the voice that would dominate that broadcast was that of Stephen A. Smith. But to understand what Stephen A. was about to say, we need to go back a few hours. We need to understand the routine that shaped him in each one of his absolute convictions. Waking up early was more than a habit for Stephen A. It was sacred ritual. Naturally, this leads us to understand that people who change the world never do it sleeping. The alarm clock rang at 5:30 in the morning. Before even coffee, before the lukewarm shower that awakened his muscles, he was already sitting in a worn leather armchair, surrounded by papers, statistics, video clips, analyses that other people would never consult. It was impossible not to feel the density of that silence before dawn. The silence was deafening, whispering responsibility, because Stephen A. carried something that few understood: the absolute belief that his voice mattered, that each word he would pronounce that day would shape generations. And you can perceive how that conviction, while it propelled him forward, also imprisoned him. The smell of hot coffee rose through the empty kitchen, that specific aroma that only exists when you are the first to wake in a universe still asleep. The white ceramic cup in his hands presented a warmth that comforted him. It was not just caffeine. It was ritual. It was transformation. It was the moment when Stephen A. Smith became the voice. He leafed through the papers. Each page brought numbers, stories, arguments. But there was something more beneath those numbers. There were hierarchies. There was a narrative that he not only believed, but that he had built brick by brick over decades. The era of Michael Jordan was superior. It was not an opinion. It was established truth. It was law. How is it possible for someone to carry such an absolute conviction without ever questioning its origin? That was the question that should have echoed in his mind. But it did not echo. What echoed was only confirmation, only the validation that he was right. Hours passed. Day emerged slowly through the window of his apartment, and Stephen A. remained there, building arguments, refining words, polishing the structure of convictions that would become his armor in that broadcast. Arriving at the studio, there was something in the atmosphere that was impossible to describe with simple words. It was the tension that exists before a show. It was the coldness of the air conditioning in contrast with the accelerated breathing of everyone passing through the corridors. Producers running, cameras being adjusted. That specific studio smell, a mixture of plastic, heated electronics, and humanity imprisoned in that space. Stephen A. always arrived early. He passed through makeup. He observed the lighting. And then he sat in his place. That seat that had his name. That armchair that was practically a throne. The broadcast began. And as usual, Stephen A. dominated every moment. It was not aggression. It was mastery. It was the result of decades perfecting the art of appearing absolutely right. And then, during a segment about the legacy of the great players in history, the question emerged. An apparently simple question. Stephen A., how do you rank Stephen Curry in relation to the greatness of the previous era? You can perceive how that was the moment when everything began. Not with violence, but with words that sounded like analysis, but carried the weight of something deeper. Stephen A. breathed. That breathing that preceded his most confident pronouncements. And then he began. "Look, don't get me wrong," he said. leaning forward with that authority that made him so memorable. Stephen Curry is a great player, extraordinary even. But, and there was that but that carried the world, there exists a fundamental difference between technical excellence and true greatness. The cameras captured every nuance, and although you could not see them, because now we were in a space of only words, you could hear them. The intonation that changed, the tone that became heavier. The previous era, continued Stephen A., was forged in pure combat, in calculated aggression, in a type of obsession that demanded total sacrifice. Stephen Curry is excellent in many aspects, but do you feel it when someone is truly obsessed? When someone left parts of their humanity on the path to greatness? There was a serenity in his voice that made it all much more dangerous than if he shouted. It was the serenity of conviction. It was the calm of someone who absolutely believes in what they say. He chose to balance. Family. Balance. And that is admirable. In a personal context. But in a discussion about historical greatness, he paused. That strategic pause that left a gap for the public to fill with their own conclusions. There exists a cost for that. And then, as if that were not enough, he went further. How many times in history have you seen someone achieve true excellence while prioritizing other things? The question is not rhetorical, it is literal. Because when you examine the greatest of all eras, there is always that obsessive focus, that sacrifice that transcends the ordinary. His colleagues listened. Some agreed. Some nodded slowly. And then, as always, others slightly challenged him. But Stephen A. was in his element. He refuted each argument with the precision of someone who had built that castle of words brick by brick. The problem, he said, pointing slightly at the camera, is that modern culture wants you to believe that you can have it all. Professional excellence and balanced personal life. And while I respect that human aspiration, that smile, that was only one side of his mouth. History shows us that this is an adorable illusion. The broadcast continued, but the seeds had already been planted. The words had already been spoken. And although Stephen A. could not perceive it in that moment, he had done something much more significant than present a sports analysis. He had perpetuated a cycle that began long before him, a cycle that had harmed many people over many years, a cycle that compared each generation with the previous one and found them deficient, a cycle that created hierarchies where the only true excellence was that which resembled the past. Messages began appearing on social media. Some people fiercely supported his analysis, others questioned. But the effect was already in motion. Stephen A. Smith had spoken, and people listened. When the broadcast ended, he stood from that seat that was practically a throne. He removed the microphone from his chest, and he walked to the backstage, completely confident that he had spoken the truth, completely convinced that he had fulfilled his responsibility to inform the public. But then, in the corridors of the studio, as he walked toward the dressing room, a producer approached. That nervous smile that producers acquire when they need to pass along news that is not exactly what you expect. Stephen A., we have an update for tomorrow. Michael Jordan wants to be on the program to discuss the current era of basketball, specifically to discuss some of your recent analyses. Stephen A.'s heart accelerated. It was not fear. It was something like anticipation. It was that feeling of opportunity, of a chance to reaffirm his positions with Michael Jordan himself listening. But there was something in the way the producer said that. an unstated intention, a quality in the voice that suggested that this was not an opportunity. It was a warning. Stephen A. confirmed with a nod of his head. But as he drove home that night, as he drove through the streets of New York under the light rain that began to fall, his criticisms echoed in his mind differently. The same words that made him appear authoritative during the broadcast now had a disturbing quality. His voice in his own head sounded different. But he pushed that feeling down, because Stephen A. Smith believed in his analysis. And believing was being right. Or so he thought. Because what he still did not understand was that the next day, as he sat in that same studio, as he waited for the one who was considered the greatest player of all time, something fundamental in his world would begin to disintegrate. Not with violence, not with aggression, but with something much more powerful, with truth reflected in a mirror he never expected to find. But what Stephen A. did not know was that Monday evening would be profoundly different from all the evenings that preceded it. And when you understand this, you also understand that the moments that change our lives rarely announce their arrival. They simply happen. And suddenly, everything is different. The early morning hours after the broadcast were long. Stephen A. slept little. That sensation you experience when your body rests, but your mind cannot shut off. The clock marked 3:47 in the morning when he gave up trying to sleep. He got up. He walked to the window, and he observed the city still awake, as if New York never slept completely. He thought about his words. He went through his arguments, and that strange thing began to happen. The same words that made him seem absolutely authoritative during the broadcast now sounded different, as if they had an additional layer of meaning that he had never noticed before. True greatness requires total sacrifice. That phrase echoed in his mind, and for the first time, a small question began to form. Why did he believe this? Where had that belief come from? He tried to stifle the question, because questions led to places he was not sure he desired to explore. The coffee he prepared in the early morning hours was hotter than usual, or perhaps he was just more sensitive to that sensation. His hands trembled slightly as he held the cup, not from cold, from something that approached apprehension. Arriving at the studio a few hours later, there was something in the atmosphere that was impossible to describe with precision. Producers whispering, a tension that was not the usual tension of a live broadcast. It was something else. It was something like expectation, or perhaps omen. A colleague approached him backstage. That nervousness that colleagues acquire when they know something that you do not yet fully know. Stephen A., did you hear? Michael Jordan arrived. He is in the production room. And the colleague paused. That pause that carries meaning. He seemed serious, silent, different. Different how? Asked Stephen A., trying to sound casual. But you can perceive that the tone of his voice revealed something else. It revealed concern, or perhaps recognition that something important was about to happen. I don't know exactly, continued the colleague, shaking his head. It's like he is observing everything, like he is waiting for something specific. Stephen A. nodded, trying to maintain his composure. But internally, something was changing. A thing that you experience when your body perceives something that your mind has not yet fully processed. A visceral sensation, a chill down your spine that has no rational explanation. When he finally saw Michael Jordan in the corridors of the studio, it was as if time had a different quality. His presence filled the space, not in an aggressive way, but in an undeniable way. It was as if all the energy of that studio reorganized itself around him. And Jordan's eyes. Those were eyes that you never forgot. Not of anger, not of judgment, but of recognition, of understanding, of someone who had seen everything and carried the weight of that in every movement. Stephen A. walked in the direction of Jordan. His body functioned by habit. His face maintained that expression of confidence that defined him. But internally? Internally, something strangely fragile was beginning to appear. "Michael," said Stephen A., extending his hand. "What an honor to have you here." Jordan shook Stephen A.'s hand. The grip was firm, but there was something in the quality of that touch that communicated more than words. It was as if Jordan was transmitting a message through that simple grip. "I see you. I understand you. And we need to talk about something." "Stephen," responded Jordan, and that smile that was not exactly a complete smile. "Good to see you, man." The word man was pronounced in a way that carried weight. It was not hostility, but it was intentionality. It was the quality of voice you use when speaking with someone you know on a level that transcends casual explanation. Backstage, as the broadcast prepared to begin, Stephen A. felt that strange thing, that gap between his public confidence and his private doubt. It was as if two versions of himself were existing simultaneously. One was the Stephen A. that you knew, confident, authoritative, absolutely certain of his position. The other was someone different, someone who wondered, what if I were wrong? He tried to focus on his research, on his prepared arguments, on all those statistics that made him appear impeccable in numerous previous discussions. But something had changed. The words did not seem as solid as before. A production woman called him for makeup. As she applied powder and prepared his face for the cameras, he observed himself in the mirror. And it was in that moment that something strange happened. For the first time in a long time, he really saw himself. Not as the voice, not as the respected commentator, but as a man who had made certain choices, a man who had embraced certain convictions, a man who, perhaps, had never really questioned where those convictions came from. "Are you all right?" asked the makeup woman, seeing that expression pass across his face. "Yes," answered Stephen A., perhaps a little too quickly. "Just thinking." The hours moved. Time had a strange quality. It was as if it moved very quickly and very slowly at the same time. And then, finally, the moment arrived. The lights turned on. The cameras began to roll. The broadcast began. And Stephen A. was sitting in that seat that was practically a throne, waiting for what would come next. The presenter made the announcement with that voice that presenters use when something significant is about to happen. "We have with us this evening an extraordinary guest, a legend who shaped not just basketball, but an entire era, Michael Jordan." And then Jordan entered. And something changed in the air. It was not theatricality. It was reality bending under the weight of a truly significant presence. The presenter began with the usual questions: basketball, career, legacy. And Jordan answered with the grace of someone who had done that thousands of times. But then, that moment arrived, that moment that Jordan had come to wait for. The presenter asked, "Michael, do you follow modern basketball analysis closely, especially commentators like Stephen A. here?" And it was in that instant that everything began, because Stephen A. felt that shift in energy. Jordan breathed, that breathing that precedes something important, and then he turned in the direction of Stephen A. That smile that was no longer just polite. It was knowledgeable. It was that of someone who knew exactly what he was about to say, and why. "Yes," said Jordan, his voice carrying a quality that commanded the attention of every person in that studio and every person watching at home. "I have been following. And there is something I really need to talk to you about, Stephen. And it is impossible not to feel when a moment is becoming historical. The public could feel it. The producers could feel it. And Stephen A., sitting in that seat that had seemed a throne only moments before, could feel it. Because he knew, in that specific instant, that nothing would be the same after this. What he did not know was why. He did not yet understand that Michael Jordan was about to show him something he had spent decades without seeing, something that was right in front of him all along, something that was, in its essence, a reflection of himself. Because that which you offer to the world is that which you carry inside, and sometimes the world sends you a mirror so that you can finally see. No one could imagine that that moment would be the turning point. And when you understand this, you also understand that the moments that really matter rarely come announced with trumpets. They come with silence, with bated breath, with the sensation that the air around you has become more dense. Michael Jordan breathed deeply. That breathing you hear when someone is about to say something they have carried with them for a very long time. Very, very long time. "Yes," said Jordan, his voice occupying the entire space of that studio. "I have been following, and there is something I really need to talk to you about, Stephen. About these analyses, about that narrative you have constructed." The presenter shifted uncomfortably. That shift in energy was palpable. Producers were probably looking at each other, perceiving that this was not casual conversation. This was something more. Stephen A. felt that strange thing, that sensation when you know you are about to be confronted, but still do not understand why. He tried to respond with his usual rhetoric, with that confidence that defined him. "Michael, I respect your perspective immensely, but—" But Jordan raised his hand. Not aggressively, just with authority. "Let me finish," said Jordan, "because what you are doing now, this is exactly what they did to me. Exactly. And you don't even know you are doing it." And it was, in that instant, that the silence became deafening. As you can perceive when the world around you disappears, and only two people exist in that space. Jordan continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of observation. "When I played, Stephen, people said things about me. Things very similar to what you are saying about Curry. They said I was too aggressive, that I prioritized victory above everything, that I didn't know how to lose gracefully. And you know what that was? It was a narrative. A way of saying that my excellence was problematic, that my obsession was unhealthy." Stephen A. opened his mouth, but nothing came out, because something had begun to happen inside him, a thing that you experience when your certainties begin to tremble. "And after I won everything, after I proved I was right?" Jordan paused, that pause that carries an entire world of meaning. People created new comparisons, new hierarchies, because humans always need a way to measure value. And the measure you are using, Stephen? It is a measure that has harmed many people, over many generations. The presenter tried to intervene, but Jordan did not let him. Because that which you offer to the world can only be offered once, and Jordan had been waiting for this moment. "What you do not understand is that this is a cycle," continued Jordan, pointing at Stephen A. with an intention that transcended aggression. You criticize Curry for not having the killer instinct of the previous era. But when you say this, what are you really saying? You are saying that excellence has only one form. One. And that form is the form of the previous era. Stephen A. felt his hands trembling, not from fear, from something like recognition, from truth being spoken aloud for the first time. How many generations, asked Jordan, how many generations need to pass before we realize that each era brings its own magic? That it is not about being better or worse. It is about being different and equally great. The silence in the studio was almost palpable. You could feel it, a density that occupied every empty space. Jordan breathed again, and then what no one expected happened. His voice changed, from confrontation to something more vulnerable, more personal. "Do you know why this hurts me so much?" asked Jordan. "Because I made the same mistake. When Larry Bird came up in certain conversations, I could not simply celebrate. I needed to prove I was better. I needed to create hierarchies. And you know how many years I wasted on that? How many connections I lost because I was too busy being superior?" And in that moment, Stephen A. saw something in Jordan's eyes that changed him forever. It was not judgment. It was compassion. It was someone who had walked exactly the same path and was extending a hand to help someone find their way back. "I changed," continued Jordan. "It took decades, but I changed. And you know what I learned? That true strength is not in needing everyone to be smaller so that you appear larger. True strength is in celebrating, in recognizing that each person adds to the fabric, that each generation brings its own shine." Stephen A. felt something break inside him, not painfully, but as a necessary rupture, as a structure that had imprisoned his understanding finally beginning to yield. "And now," said Jordan, "seeing you do this with Curry, seeing you perpetuate exactly the cycle that harmed me, that harmed so many other people," Jordan breathed. "I needed to be here, not to condemn you, but to be a mirror, so that you could finally see." The presenter tried to formulate something to say. The producers were probably in panic backstage, realizing that this had transcended normal programming. This was history being made in real time. And Stephen A.? Stephen A. was having a moment that you cannot easily describe with words. It was as if decades of convictions were disintegrating simultaneously, as if the entire structure through which he saw the world was being rebuilt in real time. Because when you finally see yourself through the eyes of someone who experienced what you caused, when you finally understand that your analysis was actually reproduction of cycles of injustice, this is not defeat. It is awakening. Stephen A. opened his mouth, and for once in his life he did not know exactly what to say. The confidence had disappeared, and in its place was something more raw, more real, more human. "I," began Stephen A. "I had not thought about it that way." And those simple words carried the weight of an entire transformation. Jordan leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Stephen A.'s. "That which you just said? That is the first true thing you have said about this subject. I had not thought about it that way. Because when you really think, when you really examine the cycle, it is impossible not to see." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of confrontation. It was the silence of something fundamental changing, of someone beginning to see the world differently. "And the next question you need to ask," continued Jordan, his voice now softer, "is, how many other people am I influencing the same way? How many other people am I teaching to perpetuate this cycle? Because you have platform, Stephen. You have voice. And the question now is, what are you going to do with it? Stephen A. felt the tears beginning to form. Not of humiliation, but of recognition, of truth penetrating layers that he had protected for a long time. Stephen A. breathed deeply. You are right. 3 words. Only 3 words. But they echoed through studios, through screens, through the hearts of millions of people who were watching. Because rare is the moment when someone with platform genuinely admits being wrong. But in that studio, on that Monday evening, it was exactly this that happened. Yes, continued Stephen A., his voice trembling with emotion that was genuine enough to not be faked. Yes, you are right. I was doing exactly that. Without realizing, but doing it. And then, in that moment of absolute truth, Michael Jordan did something that no one in that entire studio expected. He approached Stephen A., and he hugged him. It was not a performative hug. It was real. It was the hug of a man who had seen someone finally begin to awaken. Of someone who knew exactly what that journey was like because he had walked it. And when they separated, Stephen A. had tears in his eyes, tears of someone who had just seen himself, for the first time in many years, for the first time, truly. What now? Asked Stephen A., his voice small, vulnerable, genuine. Now, said Jordan. Now you choose. You continue perpetuating cycles. Or you break them. You continue creating hierarchies. Or you celebrate. It is your choice, Stephen. It always was. But now you know. And knowing changes everything. And it was then that the truth finally came to light. Not in a spectacular way, but in a silent, persistent, inevitable way. As real truths always arrive, not with trumpets, but with a transformation that you feel long before you fully understand. The minutes that followed the embrace between Stephen A. and Michael Jordan were strange. The presenter did not know how to proceed. The producers were probably in complete chaos backstage. Because what had happened in that studio transcended protocol. It transcended routine. It transcended even sports journalism. It had transcended into something rarer, into genuine honesty, into compassionate confrontation, into transformation broadcast live. The broadcast ended with that moment suspended in the air. There was no conventional conclusion. Only the raw reality of 2 men who had seen each other and had been changed by that encounter. But the real transformation? That would begin after the cameras turned off. Backstage, after the broadcast, Stephen A. and Michael Jordan remained, talking. Away from cameras, away from the public. Just 2 men and the reality of what had happened. You know what impressed me? Said Jordan, his voice still carrying that quality of understanding. You listened. Really listened. Many people cannot do that. Stephen A. breathed deeply. You can perceive that each breath he took now was different, as if different lungs were functioning, as if he was breathing air from a new world. I need to do something, said Stephen A., his voice still trembling. I need to fix this, the things I said, the narratives I perpetuated. Yes, responded Jordan, placing his hand on Stephen A.'s shoulder. But more important than fixing the past is choosing differently in the future. And those words became the anchor, the buoy that Stephen A. would use to navigate the days that would come. 1 week later, Stephen A. returned to that same studio. But this time it was different. Because when you really change internally, the world around you reflects that change. I need to speak about something I said last week, began Stephen A., and the tone of his voice was different. It was not the performative confidence of before. It was genuine vulnerability. It was the tone of someone who had made a mistake and was willing to admit it. I criticized Stephen Curry for his personal and family choices. I suggested that this compromised his greatness. And while I was saying that, I did not understand that I was perpetuating a destructive cycle, a cycle that has harmed many people over many generations. His colleagues listened in silence, because rare is it to witness someone with platform and power genuinely admit a mistake. But in that studio, on that morning, it was exactly this that was happening. Michael Jordan came here, continued Stephen A., not to attack me, but to be a mirror, to show me that I was doing exactly what they did to him and to so many others. And then Stephen A. did something that perhaps was even more significant. He changed his narrative about Curry, not minimizing his technical analysis, but celebrating the innovation, celebrating the revolution, celebrating Curry's choice to be great on his own terms. "Stephen Curry," said Stephen A., and there was genuine admiration in his voice, "is one of the greatest players of all time, not despite his personal choices, but as part of his completeness, because true greatness does not mean sacrificing your humanity. It means integrating excellence with integrity." In the days and weeks that followed, something began to happen. Not dramatically, but inevitably. Because when you change the narrative that you amplify to millions of people, the world around you begins to change as well. Other commentators began to question their own hierarchies. Other influential voices began to examine their own unconscious cycles. And it all began with a man who was courageous enough to admit that he was wrong. Stephen A., in his apartment a few days later, sitting in that same worn armchair where he had begun his journey, went through the moments. The coffee no longer had the same taste. Or perhaps he was simply different, ready to savor things differently. He picked up an old photo album, images of Michael Jordan from different eras, and when he observed those images, he saw them with new eyes, not as an impossible standard, but as a human being who had also walked a journey, who had also learned, who had also made mistakes, and that made everything more real, more human, more true. When Stephen Curry responded to questions about Stephen A.'s renewed analysis, his response was gracious. Because Curry understood something fundamental. Growth is difficult. Change is uncomfortable. And when someone really changes, they deserve respect. "I respect Stephen's journey," said Curry, with that smile that was more mirror than expression. "We are all growing. We are all learning. And if someone has the courage to say, 'I was wrong,' that is excellence different from any other." And in that moment, the circle was completed. Not because there was victory or defeat, but because there was mutual understanding. There was recognition. There was transformation that sent waves through entire communities. Months later, Stephen A. received an invitation. Michael Jordan invited him to a private conversation. Not for broadcast, not for cameras, just two men who had changed each other. During that conversation, Jordan shared stories that you do not hear in public interviews. Stories about regret, about years wasted in competition when they could have been celebration, about the late lesson he had learned. True strength is not in being better. It is in celebrating differences. "What you did," said Jordan to Stephen A., "by choosing to change, this is going to reverberate. You cannot imagine how many people, watching, thought, 'Maybe I can also recognize my cycles. Maybe I can also change.'" And that was true, because personal, Transformation is contagious. When someone genuinely changes, that change affects everyone around them. Stephen A. now observed each program with a different intention. Not to prove he was right, but to celebrate, to recognize, to break cycles he did not understand he was perpetuating. And when he spoke about modern players, the narrative had changed. It was no longer hierarchy. It was harmony. It was no longer comparison. It was coexistence, each era bringing its magic, each generation bringing its shine. Because this is what happens when you finally see the mirror. When you finally understand that that which you offered to the world was reflection of that which you carried inside. When you finally choose to be part of the solution instead of perpetuation of the problem. Stephen A. Smith's journey did not end on that Monday evening. It began. It began in the moment he chose to listen. It began in the moment he chose to be vulnerable. It began in the moment he chose to change. And, although no one can see the echoes of a personal transformation on your face or in the streets you walk, you can hear it. You can hear it in each word you choose to pronounce. You can hear it in the way you frame conversations. You can hear it in the intention you place in your voice each day. Because when you really change, when you really see, the entire world reorganizes itself around that understanding. And Michael Jordan, somewhere in the world, knowing that he had succeeded, not conquered, but saved. He had saved someone from repeating his mistakes. He had broken a cycle that could have echoed for more generations, because sometimes true leadership is not in dominating. It is in helping someone awaken. And when that awakening happens, when someone finally sees themselves in the eyes of someone who loves them despite everything, in that moment, in that precise instant, the mirror is broken. But from the broken glass is born a light that never existed before, a light of truth, of humility, of renewed possibility. And that light reverberates forever.